Hi, I'm Tom Biebighauser with Wetland Restoration and Training. Do you know it's entirely possible to build wetlands on saturated ground and not get the heavy equipment stuck? That's what we did near Creston in British Columbia. What we did is we built a series of wetlands that would provide habitat for the rare northern leopard frog and the western painted turtle. And we built them so they'd be supplied primarily with groundwater, which is a good thing because the area generally doesn't receive enough precipitation to keep wetlands full unless you have groundwater helping to supply them. Well, we're going to be looking at how you can use logs to keep your heavy equipment afloat and how you can do this efficiently and effectively, and that you can build beautiful wetlands like the one we see here at a very low cost. Well, let's get started.
The Duck Lake South project was completed in 2016 to provide breeding habitat for the northern leopard frog. The project took place on the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area near Creston, British Columbia. The northern leopard frog is a red-listed species in British Columbia. The frog could only be found breeding in one constructed impoundment in the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area when we designed the project. Let me introduce you to Marc-Andre Boucher, the manager of the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area. Marc-Andre is holding a northern leopard frog that he captured along the banks of the Old Goat River Channel. Here's our dedicated team of biologists that worked together to design the Duck Lake South project. We planned to build wetlands the northern leopard frog could use for breeding. We designed 6 wetlands to be built in old fields that were located between where the northern leopard frogs were currently breeding and where they were wintering. It was very important to our team that the wetlands would not contain water all year. This was because non-native species, including the American bullfrog and the bluegill sunfish, would colonize wetlands that held water all year, and they would kill the northern leopard frogs. We chose shallow basins within old fields that were dominated by reed canary grass to build the wetlands. These fields were once part of the nearby Duck Lake that was partially drained by the construction of dikes, ditches, and the installation of buried drainage structures. These fields where the wetlands were going to be built, they were made by draining wetlands years ago. The elevation of groundwater in the reed canary grass fields was about 1 meter below the surface during the growing season and near the surface during the winter and spring. Deep soil test holes showed us that silt loam texture soil was within 1 meter of the surface, with dense clay texture soil greater than 1 meter below the surface. Groundwater entered the holes that we dug as we watched. The groundwater was perched over the clay. The thick layer of clay beneath the surface indicated that it should be possible to build a groundwater dam to make the wetlands hold water. However, we could not build groundwater dams because of how quickly water filled the holes that we dug. The problem would be worse in November when we planned to build the wetlands because the elevation of groundwater would be even closer to the surface. The fields where we planned to build the wetlands were located near the Old Goat River Channel that was being used by the northern leopard frog for hibernating, so we predicted that the frogs would be able to find the new wetlands. Our team seriously considered building the wetlands in areas dominated by cattails. We decided against this because the wetlands would likely hold water all year. We decided to build the wetlands in areas dominated by reed canary grass that was bordering the cattails. We found that reed canary grass grows on land with a fluctuating water table. Wetlands built on reed canary grass are likely to dry in the summer when the elevation of groundwater will drop. There was major concern that the northern leopard frogs migrating from the impoundment to the river would be run over by heavy equipment if construction were to take place before November. To avoid killing northern leopard frogs, we decided to build the wetlands in late November when the frogs were hibernating in the very bottom of the Old Goat River Channel. We also decided to build the wetlands with different depths so they would hold water for different lengths of time. This way, at least one of the wetlands should contain water the right length of time for frog larvae to develop, either in drought or in wet years. We used a handheld soil auger to dig holes near the center of each wetland that we designed in the fall, which was the same time of year that we planned on building the wetlands. The soil test hole showed that the surface of the ground was soft enough that excavators would get stuck unless logs were used to keep them afloat. I prepared a detailed set of wetland design forms with an estimated budget for building each wetland, and this was done at a cost of less than $2,000. I was not required to incur the high expense associated with working with a consulting firm to prepare engineering plans with specifications for construction of the wetlands. A service contract was signed with Schopas Excavating, located in Creston, BC, for providing 2 excavators and 1 dozer to complete the project. Schopas Excavating would be paid by the hour for providing the heavy equipment and operators needed to build the wetlands. It's of great importance to have the right heavy equipment and skilled operators when building wetlands on saturated soil. I recommend using excavators that weigh around 66,000 pounds with approximately 185 horsepower and ground pressure less than 6 pounds per square inch. The excavator must have a thumb attachment for moving logs. Excavators having a ground pressure greater than 6 pounds per square inch are likely to sink in the mud and get stuck. A low ground pressure dozer with wide tracks should be used to build wetlands on saturated ground. The dozer is much faster than the excavator in moving soil distances greater than 20 meters. I recommend using a dozer that weighs at least 36,500 pounds with 168 horsepower and ground pressure less than 5 pounds per square inch. The LGP dozer floats on the mud and rarely gets stuck. The excavator is used to dig the basin for the wetland, while the dozer is used to move the soil away from the excavator and outside of the area where the wetland is being built. I recommend using 2 excavators and 2 dozers that are working together to build large wetlands on saturated soil. I have learned that 1 excavator can keep 1 dozer busy pushing soil. If you only have 1 dozer working with 2 excavators, the dozer operator will get behind and the excavators will need to help move the soil by picking it up and swinging it many times. This can take forever if the excavator operator must use logs to keep the machine from sinking. Here you can see where a dozer on low ground pressure dozer tracks can travel through the shallow water and the mud, staying up on the reed canary grass without getting stuck. It's especially important to use logs when building a wetland on organic soil like what is taking place in this video. The heavy equipment is more likely to get stuck when traveling over saturated organic soil compared to traveling over sand or clay. Here the excavators are helping the dozer operator get caught up by moving the soil away from the wetland being built. It's always a good idea to purchase logs in advance and have them available for the excavator operator to use when needed. Their use can save the excavator operator from getting stuck, which is both embarrassing and costly. Here you can see how much work it takes to remove an excavator that has gotten stuck building a wetland. Unless they have experience working on wet ground, most contractors will refuse to operate on saturated soil. Keeping the excavator afloat on logs will greatly reduce the chance of getting stuck. It's very important that the excavator operator has logs to use to keep it from sinking. The operator arranges these logs in a row, then climbs on top of them to keep from sinking when moving across the work area and while digging. Ted Crane was our primary excavator operator. His skill and extensive experience operating heavy equipment on wet ground was key to our success with this project. Dwight Evans operated the low ground pressure dozer. He is the most skilled and productive dozer operator I've ever worked with across Canada. The logs are needed because the excavator will pull itself deep into the ground when it is digging. The vibration of the excavator while operating also makes it sink into the mud. People can't believe how effective logs are at keeping the excavator from getting stuck. It's like the machine is in a large boat. The excavator with the thumb attachment can easily pick up and move the logs as needed. Here the dozer is moving logs into position for the excavator. Notice how the operator keeps the blade high so it does not break through the sod layer. Some of the logs can be expected to break while building a wetland. Broken logs can be placed in the wetland to provide loafing sites for ducks and basking sites for turtles. Some people use wood mats that are made out of squared timbers for flotation. I have found that wood mats are more expensive than logs. Another concern is that the wood mats will break and they must be replaced during construction. Plan on providing at least 20 logs that are 20 foot long each for each excavator to use every week the machine is working to build wetlands. The logs should be at least 20 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. Logs that are too long are difficult to move and will get in the way of piling soil. These logs are too short. The excavator can slide off of them and get stuck. These logs are too small in diameter. They will break under the weight of an excavator. Each log should be similar in diameter on both ends. The excavator can slide off the logs if one end of the log is much greater in diameter than the other end of the log. It's okay to trim large ends of the logs with a chainsaw to make them more uniform in diameter along their entire length. The logs should be cut from live trees, not dead trees, so they're stronger. The species of trees that work well for logs include Douglas fir and western larch. Cedar, cottonwood, and hemlock are too soft and are likely to break. The logs should be ordered in advance and piled where the excavators can readily access them. A load of logs may be purchased from a logger in the area. A full-size logging truck and trailer may be able to deliver 45 logs that are 40 feet long at one time. Here the excavator is being used to unload logs that are 20 feet long. Delivering the logs with a self-loading or hook truck makes it easy to unload the logs at the site in advance of construction. This way an excavator does not have to be there to remove them from the truck and trailer. A chainsaw is needed to cut the 40-foot logs in half or to trim the ends of the logs that are too large in diameter. The cost of logs varies considerably depending on location and how far they need to be transported. In Canada, we are paying an average of $128 for a 40-foot log or $64 for a 20-foot log. This price includes delivery to the worksite. Prior to construction, use a laser and a dual-sided grade rod to confirm the area where you plan on building a wetland has less than a 60 centimeter change in elevation from upper to lower edge. Use colored plastic flagging to mark the perimeter of the wetland you plan on building. Now use the laser and rod to identify the low edge along the perimeter of the wetland you're building. The low edge can serve as the spillway for the wetland that you're building. Use different colored plastic ribbons to mark the spillway, and then ask the heavy equipment operators not to disturb the vegetation in the path of the spillway or to pile soil in the path of the spillway. Record the elevation of the low edge or the spillway on a piece of paper, and then use this during the construction of the wetland. Walk around the wetland with a GPS and map the perimeter of the wetland you're building. It's going to be necessary for you to remark portions of the perimeter as the dozer pushes over the ribbons. Now ask an excavator operator to dig a test hole near the center of the wetland you're building. Here we're taking an elevation reading at the upper level where we see water entering the hole. Wait for the water to stop rising in the hole. Use the laser and grade rod to take an elevation reading at the surface of water in the hole. The maximum elevation of water in the wetland you're building will be the same as the elevation of water in the hole. However, one can expect the elevation of water to be higher outside of the growing season for plants and lower during the growing season. Let's say you would like to have 100 centimeters of water in the wetland you're building next year at the same time of year. Water rises in the test hole that you've dug to 100 centimeters below the surface of the ground. This means you'll need to dig the basin so that it's 200 centimeters lower than the elevation of the spillway of the wetland that you're building. Describe to the excavator operator that you would like to make the wetland deepest in the middle with gradual slopes, much like the shape of a very large satellite dish. Walk with the excavator operator to the center of the wetland you're building and take an elevation reading on the surface of the ground. Subtract from this number the elevation reading for the planned bottom of the wetland that you're building. The difference will be how deep you will need to dig in the middle of the wetland to obtain the planned depth of water. Share this information with the excavator operator so they will have an idea how to slope the inside of the wetland that you're building. Show the excavator and dozer operators where to push and spread the soil. You'll need an area at least 20% larger than the wetland you're building in which to spread the soil. This aerial photo shows where the soil was spread from building two large wetlands and a stream by using the groundwater technique. Construction of the Duck Lake South wetlands began by removing shrubs that were growing within the marked perimeter of the wetland being built. These were saved for placing in the finished wetland to provide frogs and turtles with places to hide from predators. The excavator operator traveled to the far end of the wetland being built, opposite of where the soil was going to be spread. The excavator operator begins digging at the base of the colored ribbons, shaping a gradual downhill slope towards the center of the wetland being built. It is very important that the excavator operators use the logs while digging. The logs can be easily moved with the machine as it works over the wet ground. Often the operators think they will be okay if they don't use the logs, and that is when they get stuck. They won't get stuck if they use the logs. The excavator operators begin digging at the colored flags, filling their buckets with soil, and then spinning around, depositing their soil as far back as they could reach. Their tracks are placed perpendicular, not parallel to the hole being dug. This is so they don't tip over and slide into the water. The excavators remove all the soil within their reach and then shift over to dig another section. They generally move the machine from right to left so they can keep watch to make sure they don't hit the dozer when they turn to deposit the soil. The dozer operator looks for ways to get behind the piled soil and not back into the wetland that's been dug. The dozer operator must push the soil a considerable distance beyond the back edge of the wetland being built. An area is needed that's about 20% greater than the size of the wetland being built in order to spread the soil. Try to spread the soil on higher ground and not fill existing wetlands or historically drained wetlands. It may not be possible to pile the soil more than 1 meter high because the soil will be soft and the dozer or excavator can get stuck trying to travel on top of the mud. The excavator drops the soil as far away as possible from the edge of the hole that's being dug. This is very important because the dozer operator needs room to drive between the wetland being dug and the piled soil. Here the dozer travels alongside the excavator to push the soil away from the machine. Once there is enough room, the dozer slips in alongside the excavator and begins pushing the soil outside of the flagged area. The excavator operator may need to slow down so the dozer operator can keep up with spreading the soil. The excavator operator needs to watch how large and how tall it's piling the soil. Everyone needs to work together to make sure the excavator does not make such a large pile that the dozer has trouble moving it. The excavator operator may need to slow down and move less soil to give the dozer time to catch up. You're watching highly experienced dozer and excavator operators in this video. They know that at times the excavators will need to take a break from digging and help the dozer move the pile of soil. The dozer operator must not try to break through the sod, as the sod helps keep the machine afloat. Watch to make sure the dozer is not spreading soil within the wetland you're building. Dropping the soil too early will result in making the wetland much smaller than planned. Stay on site during construction and use the GPS on your smartphone along with wire flags to remark the edge of the wetland being built as needed. Expect the hole you are digging to fill within minutes. This is why it's important to watch the excavator operator to see that the wetland is being built exactly the way you want it to be built. Let the operators know if you want them to dig deeper or to leave more or higher mounds. Take elevations on a regular basis to see if the wetland is being dug to your specifications. Let the operators know if you want any changes before they move to dig another section, as it's inefficient and almost impossible to return after the logs and the soil have been removed. Ted Crane, who is operating the large excavator, moves over the logs to transfer the soil piled by the smaller excavator. We built wetlands for the project so they would contain large areas of shallow water for northern leopard frog egg laying. Areas of water from 130 to 180 centimeters deep were made in the center of each wetland. The varying depths produced wetlands with different hydro periods, which is critical to larval development in wet or dry years. The excavator operators were asked to dig a large basin that was deepest in the middle with gradual inside slopes. However, the surface of the basin was to be full of imperfections, such as clumps, dips, and mounds. The basin of each wetland was shaped with varied topography containing shallow depressions, pits, and mounds. Mounds of loose soil, shaped like muskrat houses and beaver lodges, were formed in the wetlands for burrowing habitat and to increase plant diversity. The rough basins, combined with the periodic drying, should help prevent reed canary grass, cattails, or water shield from dominating the new wetlands. This wetland is only 1 day old. It's still filling with groundwater. The shrubs removed earlier were partially buried in the wetlands to provide hiding cover for the northern leopard frog and for the western painted turtle. The shrubs were anchored using piles of soil. Logs and pieces of logs were placed in the wetlands to provide loafing sites for waterfowl and basking sites for turtles. Some of the logs were pushed into the soil at an angle so they could be used by the western painted turtle at various water levels. It was very difficult for the dozer operator to shape the soil that was removed from building the wetlands. The dozer could only push it so far before it started sinking into the mud. The piles grew wider and started infringing on the area where we wanted to build the wetland. There was a real concern that the heavy equipment would get stuck in the mud on top of the piles. The excavators would form relays to move the soil outside of the area where the wetland was being built. They too had to be careful not to get stuck in the mud. It was slow going because they had to stay on the logs to avoid getting stuck. Our progress would have been much greater if 2 low ground pressure dozers were on site, and especially if we were allowed to build the wetlands in September or October when the top meter of soil was dry. Dwight, our dozer operator, found a way of spreading the mud piles. He noticed it was getting cold at night and that the soil on the surface of the ground was freezing. He took advantage of the hard surface and found that the low ground pressure dozer could travel over the frozen ground and shape the chunks of soil and ice, much like spreading gravel. Ted Crane showed us how a log and an excavator could be used to shape the piles of soil. A big concern in building these wetlands is the management of the soil removed from digging the wetlands. The soil removed from building the wetlands was spread so the area could be mowed with a tractor and a bush hog. A seed mix designed for establishing pasture was sown on the exposed soil. Weeds could be controlled by periodically mowing the spread soil with a tractor and a bush hog or by cutting the hay. The spread soil can also be seeded to native wildflowers. The soil removed from building the wetlands can be seeded to a mixture of native wildflowers to provide habitat for pollinators. Here's how one of the wetlands appeared as it was starting to fill with groundwater. It took us 2 weeks to build the wetlands using 1 dozer and 2 excavators. The 6 wetlands we built totaled 3.41 hectares or 8.4 acres. They ranged in size from 0.35 to over 0.76 hectares. Here's how one of the wetlands appeared 1 year after construction. Here's another wetland we built for the project 1 year later. We shaped the wetland like an abandoned river channel. Here's how one of the new wetlands appears 2 years after construction. This wetland is also 2 years old. The wetlands were soon populated by the northern leopard frog, Columbia spotted frog, and the western painted turtle. We built the wetlands to require little if any maintenance. There were no dams, berms, diversions, pumps, or water control structures used in their construction. A diversity of native aquatic plants are now growing in the wetlands. These were not seeded or planted.
Well, the skill of the heavy equipment operators combined with our use of logs allowed us to build these wetlands to provide habitat for the northern leopard frog and for the western painted turtle and not get stuck in the mud, which is a really good thing. Now, these wetlands that we built are going to be supplied with groundwater. That means if it doesn't rain very much, they're still going to have the water they need to provide habitat for all these rare species. Now, when you see these wetlands go dry, don't get worried. It's a normal thing. This means that they're not going to support the bullfrog and they're not going to support non-native fish species. Well, I'm Tom Biebikhauser. I'm with Wetland Restoration and Training, and I invite you to like this video, to share it with others, and especially please subscribe and get out there and start building wetlands.